So Kevin and I are really pleased to be here. We're really glad that Esri, as an industry representative, has been included in this discussion. And I will speak with my Esri hat on because normally I wear two hats as Tron, fighting for the users in the scientific and academic community, and then also as a staffer at Esri who reports directly to Jack. And I really appreciated Dan's remarks, always thought provoking, always insightful. And he is making some very good points about some of the Faustian bargains that could come into play with industry relationships. But one of the tidbits about Esri is that the profits that the company makes, out of those profits, about 31% of those profits go back into research and development. The normal rate for IT companies is about 8 to 10%. I think Microsoft puts about 8 to 10% back into R&D. Now, of course, they're a much bigger company, much bigger profits. But this is the reason that Jack Dangerman has invested in this workshop, because we're very interested in these questions. And as I mentioned in a couple of private discussions, this is about making Esri a better company, improving our software and our services, but also being a member, a part of science, not just a company that churns out software for profit. So this question of replicability and reproducibility is extremely important. We have so many people who use our software, and it's incumbent upon us to do right by this. We don't want Esri technology to be a deterrent or an impediment to R&R or the many other R's that we've discussed. And I think this is also tied to our persona, our self-awareness, our concept. We are always introspective as geographers. And as geospatial scientists, we measure ourselves according to other disciplines, other communities. And I think Peter did a wonderful job of putting in the different buckets, the different types of sciences, the empirical science, the computational science. Data science wasn't mentioned, but I think that falls into the computational science. And we measure ourselves according to the laboratory bench sciences. Oftentimes those are referred to as substantive sciences. So the people who are really wearing the lab coats and the safety glasses, and they're in real labs with glassware and equipment, and they are running experiments. And that's where, in my training in science as a geologist and then later on as an oceanographer, that's where the ideas of replicability, at least replicability, not reproducibility, but replicability, were driven home. Even in high school chemistry lab, with your lab notebook. And you're supposed to be able to replicate an experiment and come up with a substantive answer. And I think in terms of how science works, we in the geospatial sciences, we want to be part of that discussion. We want to be those who are also contributing to scientific insight and scientific interpretation, scientific explanation. We don't want to just be cranking out numbers and maps in black boxes and being an enabler to other people doing science. So again, this discussion, this workshop is really, really important. And one question comes to mind, what is the equivalent of doing an experiment in the geospatial sciences? How do we conduct experiments? Of course, we're a field science in many ways, but it strikes us at Esri, especially when you look at this broader framework of geospatial data science. Now, this diagram talks about 3 stages of it: data preparation, analysis, and dissemination. That's pretty straightforward. But the experiment part of it, we try to create tools, and I say we in the broader sense: Esri, Tableau, Mapbox, Boundless, the industry, those of us who make the tools to enable the science. To us, the experiment is really in the tool sets that are linked together. Now, in Esri parlance, and Jason has already done a very nice job of showing us some examples, it's Model Builder. Model Builder is something that has been around in Esri software for quite some time. At first, it was something that was not very popular, not believed in, but because it was found to be useful and very much a part of how people were making good discoveries and good interpretations, even predictions, because in the case of geodesign, we'll have this geodesign summit in a couple of weeks, and it will be very interesting to see some of the results there. I'll talk about that in a couple of seconds. But within the data preparation, but more so the analysis part of this dichotomy, that's where the workflow and workbench part of GIS comes into play, at least in terms of Esri software. So that is the experiment. That's the laboratory. That is one way. That's just one way of looking at it. But for a lot of us, Model Builder is very effective in this. It's a way to indeed replicate, because you have the functions that are chained together. You are inserting the data into those functions. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Model Builder, the colors are very substantive here, because the blue is the data, and then you have functions that are in yellow, and then the green is the result. That gets put into another set of functions, and you chain that along, and you should be able to replicate and get either the same table output. And the table is very important because it shows you all of the parameters and all of the data that are part of this experiment. And so you have all of that documentation, all of that metadata, if you will, or the map as another as the output from that Model Builder, which again shows you that result. You should be able to plug in the same data. You pass that workflow on to someone else. They plug in their data. They should be able to replicate that. And it's also, I think, reproducible, because if you're not using the same data, if you're using a different set of appropriate functions, that may be reproducible as well. We think of this in terms of the raster vector dichotomy. So there's also the raster part of this now in terms of raster function chains for raster data sets or imagery. These are different functions that you are executing on your raster data, and you can chain those together into workflows. So the workflow concept, I think, is very useful and very powerful in terms of R&R for geospatial research. The workflow is really the template for the functions. Workbench is a broader term that I believe Kevin is going to get into in much more detail, where the workbench is the broader framework, the programming language perhaps, or the platform. In our case, the ArcGIS platform is your workbench. And so as you are using the workflows in the workbench, then you get to the very important part of the dissemination that we've already been talking about. Dissemination, we've talked about containers, we've talked about notebooks, and that is sort of the coin of the realm. That is what you are sharing and passing along to those who are going to try to replicate your work or to build upon your work. I really liked our discussion yesterday of not just rubber stamping something, but building on it, improving it, taking that result, and then passing that on. So the dissemination part of this is also really important for our students, because with these workflows and workbenches, it is supposed to be a freeing thing. It's not supposed to put students in this robotic state where all they think about is point and click and pushing buttons in a blind march towards a map. If they have that part of it a bit easier for them, it's supposed to free them to think about what they're doing, to think about the process, to think about how the Earth works as they are looking at Earth data. And this is the part that I think is a frustration for many of us, and I'm digressing here, but yeah, I think Mike's comments yesterday really resonated with me in terms of working with our students, and how do we free them from this prison that they're in terms of they get through a GIS lab and they don't have the slightest idea what it was that they did. So onward and upward. But certainly as we teach our students about R and R, this is going to hopefully get easier. Now, in terms of the Esri software and the framework that we are trying to build in terms of a workbench, this is one example. This is a very busy slide that has a lot of information on it, but it's what's coming in the next revision of the software. In fact, in 10.1, if you're keeping up with all the versions of ArcGIS, we're coming into 10.7 now. So if you're at 10.0, you're missing out. 10.71 will include containers, a containerization module. It's going to be very Docker-like. I'm not at liberty to say whether it is Docker, but there are containers. Also in ArcGIS Pro 2.6. And this whole idea of notebooks has really taken off with Esri developers, as well as we're trying to actually pull many of our users along with us. So what Xiaowen was sharing yesterday about the CyberGIS notebooks is very, very welcome. I think this is a wonderful trend. So in this framework here, there are open science libraries that are part of this. So it's not all commercial and proprietary. It's a lot of open source that is inserted into this. We're working on a notebook server, not just individual notebooks for the desktop, but a server environment to make it even easier to work with notebooks. Notebook server that integrates with analytic servers that's in our, for us, the ArcGIS Enterprise. And this is supposed to enable scientists to organize their code, their data, visualizations, documentation, many of the things that we've been talking about. So that's coming, and Kevin will give you some very substantive examples of that. Now, one of the things that I forgot to say at the beginning is that my remarks are based on our position paper. So the position paper, I believe those will become, they would be shared with everyone. And these slides, I'm going to give you the URL to these slides right away. But in the position paper, we talk from our standpoint as software vendors. What should be some of the recommendations that we ourselves preach to ourselves, especially given that it's not just the software, but with every software release, things get broken, and we go through this all the time with backward incompatibility. To me, that's almost like a cure for cancer. If we can get rid of all of backward incompatibilities in software, all the software versions, that will be a big one. This has already been alluded to, especially again by Jason, that if we have workflows, and Mark has talked about this also, workflows must be shared alongside of the data whenever possible. And so we're encouraging our users to do that. The workflows must be further amplified with use cases. So this gets to the stories that people are telling about their data, about their analyses, and Dan's comments there, I think, are very germane. Even with regard to geodesign. So I mentioned the Geodesign Summit that will take place at the end of this month. I think that will be the 10th anniversary of that meeting. So there's a large group that Carl Steinitz has organized. Dan showed Steinitz's book about geodesign. And I think there are about 50 universities that are participating with different geodesign projects that they have put together. And many of those geodesign projects are using Model Builder. They're also using GeoPlanner, which is another platform for geodesign that includes weighted overlay as one of the major functions if you're going to prescribe or try to predict into the future what an urban landscape should be like. So that's a workflow that should be replicable in terms of the geodesign context. And they are sharing these workflows along with the story behind that, their use cases. So they'll be putting together a whole bunch of those and sharing those, I believe, in a poster session at Geodesign. That should be really interesting. Workflows and their associated use cases must be valued as much as journal articles and data sets. One of the ways to assign value to that is to assign it a DOI, or to make it citable, or again for the journals to pay credence to these objects, to these resources. If you can have these as part of your tenure dossier, counting as much as a paper, maybe that day will come. As best practices, those of us who are software producers should explicitly document as many aspects of the implementation of our algorithm as possible. And we'll admit that we have varying degrees of excellence in this regard, particularly with Esri software that is so multifaceted and so complex. Software producers should provide users with the ability to set a fixed seed, thus allowing exact results to be replicated. And I believe, Kevin, you're going to get into that, so I won't belabor that any further. So these are some preliminary comments that I wanted to give as a preamble to Kevin's presentation and some of the things that he's going to demo for you. These slides are immediately available along with a good portion of our position paper at this URL, which works, and I just tested it. And now I would like to give way to my great colleague, Kevin. Okay, thank you.